Hello everyone, my name is Dave Stacey. I'm a former history teacher, now lecturer at Rothrova, which is the Centre for Education at the University of Wales, Trinity St David. In this video for Impact Wales, I'm going to share a few thoughts about the new assessment arrangements proposed in the guidance for the new curriculum for Wales, and in particular the way that assessment can be used to help support individual learners on an ongoing day-to-day basis. The focus of much of the conversation then of the last few years has been on curriculum, and yet there's widespread recognition that curriculum alone is not going to be a sufficient driver to bring about all the improvements in the education system that we are hoping for. A special edition of the Curriculum Journal in 2016 pointed out that traditionally, education systems innovate as if the curriculum, pedagogy and assessment systems are independent of each other, but there may be greater mileage in thinking of them as interlinked and interdependent systems. Decisions we make about one will have an impact on another. And so while today we're focusing on assessment, I want to start by encouraging you to think about the connections between these three systems. Before we move on, my obligatory reminder that if you're a member of the Education Workforce Council, which I expect most of you are, then you'll have access to academic journals like this one through the EBSCO database, which you can access via your PLP. There's guides on how to do this via the Professional Development tab on the EWC website. So this aligned model has been the vision for curriculum for reform in Wales from its inception. But within the current guidance, you can see that there are repeated references both to the word assessment and to the word progression, which is a key idea that underpins the new model. So while it can be helpful to look at each element in turn, we have to fight the temptation to see these as separate and work to ensure that our conversations are about those points of interconnection. To help orientate us within the documentation then, the three topics identified by Impact Wales are drawn from the assessment guidance entitled Supporting Learner Progression. And it might be helpful to make this as a starting point for you as you think around assessment. And this diagram can be helpful to shape our thinking with the learner at the centre, surrounded by those four purposes, and then these key principles which Welsh Government suggests should underpin our work on assessment. Now, I don't have time in this short video to review them all, but they do help to signal some of the key shifts in thinking between our current assessment model and the one which will better support the ambition of the new curriculum and the reform programme more widely. Beyond that diagram then, the document goes on to suggest three purposes for assessment. And it's these that are the focuses of the three workshops that colleagues from Impact have developed. And just a reminder then that our focus for today is on the first of these, there you go, supporting individual learners on an ongoing day-to-day basis. I'm aware that people in our audience will have different levels of engagement with the document and particularly the guidance around assessment. So I just want to pick out one or two ideas from the start of the section on the purposes of assessment, which might help make some useful points for discussion. I don't propose to read these out. The wonderful thing about video presentations is that you're welcome to press that pause button at any point. I should say the bold in the second extract is mine. But to my mind, this whole process encourages us to put our established practices under the spotlight and ask if they continue to be fit for purpose. We need to think about what we're going to stop doing in order to make way for the new, being mindful all of the time that the answers won't be found in a document on the shelf somewhere. We're all going to need to do some of the hard thinking that those colleagues from pioneer schools were asked to do when they did such a lot of work in shaping, drafting and redrafting these curriculum documents. To give just one example from the development process, the decision to change the term achievement outcome, which was used in Successful Futures, to descriptions of learning, which is in the curriculum documentation. And it was driven by a concern that that original term had links with existing practices with a focus on assessment for summative purposes, and a desire to better signal a change in mindset towards a system that places a higher value on forward-facing assessment for formative purposes. Let's look then at this text from supporting individual learners on an ongoing day-to-day basis. And a reminder straight away then that the assessment should be supporting this shift in our focus to a holistic view of the learner and their learning. The idea of dialogue with learners is another key idea that we might want to pick up on in the discussion shortly, but I'll draw your attention to the primary focus here as being forward-looking and to identify not just additional support that may be required, but additional challenge as well. The view on assessment here isn't something that happens at the end of a unit, but is an ongoing process which feeds into and becomes part of the learning process. And this last sentence, I think, links here with some of these wider purposes that will be the focus of the other two workshops. In the materials for this session, colleagues from Impact made reference to the CAMI project. So I just want to speak briefly about what that was. It was a joint project between colleagues at the University of Wales Trinity St David's and the University of Glasgow. It was part funded by the Welsh Government, and it was designed to support staff from pioneer schools and all those involved in the development of the curriculum in moving forward thinking on progression. We reviewed literature on progression in the areas of AOLEs. We supported colleagues through workshops to capture teachers' thoughts around progressions, and we interviewed a number of those who've been involved in the process of developing these descriptions of learning for the new curriculum. We also developed a pupil experience toolkit to support teachers in capturing the views and experiences of children and young people of their experiences of progression in a way that feeds those conversations into the kinds of discussions that hopefully schools and teachers will be having. Now, the reports are available via the Athrova website and the University of Glasgow website, and the Pupil Experience Toolkit is available for anyone to use in schools. You can access it from Hub, or you can email me to get your hands on a copy as well. So in the final few minutes of this video then, I'd like to share a few ideas that could become points of discussion, as well as 7 questions which might be helpful in shaping conversations around how we support individual learners. I've already mentioned the importance of our choice of words in helping to shape our thinking. And I think we're probably all familiar with the terms summative assessment, formative assessment, assessment for and of learning. But sometimes as we become familiar with these phrases, it can stop us from pausing to think and consider what lies underneath those words. So 4 quick thoughts on this slide then. Ruth Down in her 2014 article asks us to consider assessment as learning. And how many of us are using something like multiple choice quizzes as a way of strengthening recall, strengthening learning, rather than simply as a tool for measuring? And if the same activity can be used for different purposes, perhaps, as Wyn Harlan suggests, it might be helpful to rearrange our words slightly and talk of assessment for formative purposes rather than formative assessment, shifting our focus from the assessment activity to the uses to which we put the information and insights we gain from the activity. Dylan William once commented that he considered the term responsive teaching as an alternative to assessment for learning, ultimately rejecting it as he didn't feel it sufficiently captured the role of the learner in the process. But nonetheless, I think this expression helps us shift our focus back to that Venn diagram and the interplay between learning, curriculum, and assessment. And finally then, it might be helpful to bear in mind the warning from Beth Ann Marshall and Mary Jane Drummond's paper all the way back from 2006, where they observed a focus on procedures and practices risked limiting teachers to thinking about the letter of AFL rather than the spirit. Now, we're trying hard to avoid surface learning for our students. We need to avoid that for our staff as well. Their conclusion chimes with much of what the research tells us about issues with curriculum development internationally, namely the problem of enactment. I quote, "The evidence of this project suggests that teachers need to engage in debates about learning as well as act on practical advice to bring about change." And perhaps that again reinforces the need to bring colleagues together to debate and discuss, just like hopefully this will. And so to end, some ideas, some suggestions, some provocations to feed into our session this afternoon, but also for you perhaps to take back to your school and settings as ways of kickstarting some conversations about how you can develop policies, strategies, and practice to realize this ambition of supporting individual learners on an ongoing day-to-day basis. How do we avoid that risk then of surface implementation, of that tick list approach? How do we engage all our staff in the hard thinking that's going to be needed to realize the promise of the spirit of AFL, not just the letter? I've put a reference there to Dylan Williams' book, Embedded Formative Assessment, which remains 10 years on my go-to when I'm thinking about bringing together strategy with the ideas that underpin them. Can we think about our assessment practices and be willing to ask why we do the things that we do? Daisy Christodoulou will be providing a video for another one of these sessions, and her work on the use of comparative judgment is just one area where we might want to start thinking again about the ways in which we do assessment. In those conversations then, let's be clear about the purpose of this assessment. How do we keep that focus on development, future development, rather than just judgments of past activity? If assessment is a day-to-day process, what types of feedback are most appropriate at different points? How do we avoid damaging learning with unhelpful feedback and assessment practices? The work of Robert Bjork here on ensuring desirable difficulties may be helpful. We need to recognize that there is more to learn about progression, especially in some aspects of learning, and especially at a more granular level. As teachers, we need to be not sat waiting around for the answer to ride in on a white horse. We need to roll up our sleeves and get involved in helping each other through this uncertainty, using that undoubted professional knowledge and wisdom that exists within our profession. The final two ideas here, I think, speak to the whole assessment challenge in Wales and around the world, but I've only got the one video, so I'm going to mention them here anyway. How do we ensure that we link a growing understanding of curriculum, pedagogy, assessment, and progression? These things need time, but we need to ensure that the structures we create to support them don't accidentally create silos of thought and practice. And finally, how do we shift our focus towards assessment practices which are forward-looking and focus on learners' next steps, rather than something that is primarily backwards looking with a forward glance at the end? So, no simple answers, I'm afraid, but hopefully some food for thought and some references above that might start feeding those conversations. Let me duck out the way so you can get that last one. There we go. And so there we are. Thanks for sticking with me to the end. I look forward to the discussion that's going to follow. If you're coming to the video after the event, you're welcome to contact me on Twitter, or my email address is on the screen. Thank you ever so much.